Imagine you are a physician in ancient India. A patient is carried into your clinic, right? And they've suffered this severe snake bite out in the jungle.
A really terrifying scenario for that era.
Oh, absolutely. The venom is already moving through their bloodstream, and you don't have synthetic antivenom.
Right.
You don't have a sterile syringe, or an IV drip. Instead, you reach for a piece of freshly slaughtered raw meat, and you press it directly into the open wound.
Which, I mean, sounds completely insane today.
Exactly. To a modern listener, that probably sounds like absolute madness, like a fast track to a secondary infection. But according to the architect of early Indian medicine, this was not just some desperate primitive guess.
No, not at all.
It was this highly calculated chemical extraction. The theory was that the biological properties of the raw tissue would act as, like, a localized poultice to draw out and absorb the neurotoxins before they could paralyze the nervous system.
Which is just an incredibly vivid entry point into the reality of ancient medical practice. Because we have this pervasive, almost arrogant bias today, we tend to view medical history as this very steep linear staircase.
Right, like we're at the top looking down.
Exactly. At the bottom, in the Dark Ages, you have superstition, chanting, maybe rubbing dirt on wounds, and at the top you have the enlightened, sterile, modern hospital with its MRI machines and genetic sequencing.
Yeah, we just assume that because ancient healers lacked our technology, they also lacked our capacity for rigorous scientific reasoning.
Which is completely false.
It totally is. And if you're listening to this and rolling your eyes at the idea of ancient medicine being anything more than, placebo and placebo-adjacent herbs, stick with us, because when you actually dig into the primary text, which is exactly what we are doing today, that linear view of history completely shatters.
It falls apart entirely.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into the life, the mind, and the towering legacy of a man known universally as the father of Indian medicine.
Maharishi Charaka.
Yes. And our mission today is to figure out how this singular historical figure, working over 2,000 years ago, managed to map out an entire system of personalized healthcare, holistic wellness, and preventative lifestyle medicine.
All those modern buzzwords.
Literally the exact buzzwords that modern healthcare startups use today to raise billions of dollars. And Charaka mapped it out by taking a patient's pulse in a rural village.
It is a phenomenal story. And to really appreciate the sheer gravity of what he achieved, we have to pull back a bit. We need to look at the socio-political and intellectual landscape of ancient India.
Setting the scene.
Right. So we are placing ourselves roughly around the transition from the first millennium BCE into the early century CE.
Okay.
Prior to this period, if you fell ill in the Indian subcontinent, the approach to healing was heavily dominated by the Vedic tradition.
Which was very spiritual, right?
Very. It was largely rooted in mythological lore, magico-religious rites, incantations. Disease was frequently attributed to external supernatural forces.
Like a curse or something.
Exactly. You offended a deity, you were cursed by an enemy, or there was some vague spiritual imbalance. So the cure, therefore, was heavily ritualistic.
Right.
You might use basic herbal remedies, sure, but they were administered alongside hymns and prayers designed to appease those unseen forces.
It was a system where the priest and the physician were essentially the exact same job title.
Exactly. But then, right around the time Charaka enters the historical record, there is this seismic shift in how human beings are thinking about the natural world.
A shift away from the supernatural.
Yes. Toward structured, empirical science. People are suddenly observing the physical world, categorizing plants and animals, and seeking rational, observable causes for human suffering.
And that transition is where Charaka operates.
He is at the absolute vanguard of pushing medicine away from theology and into biology.
Okay, so let's talk about the man himself, because I really want to make the biography the central spine of this deep dive. Before we can understand this massive, complex medical system he left behind, we need to know who is actually doing the thinking here. But reading through the historical translations and all the scholarly analyses of his life, I quickly ran into a massive wall. Figuring out who Charaka actually was is, well, it's like trying to nail jelly to a tree.
Oh, totally.
The timeline for his life is incredibly fuzzy.
Fuzzy is a very polite way to describe it, honestly. The historical dating of Charaka is one of the most fiercely debated topics in Indology and the history of medicine.
I mean, I'm seeing dates that span centuries. You've got the Dutch scholar Gerrit Jan Molenveld, who wrote the definitive history of Indian medical
A
literature.
brilliant scholar.
Yeah, he places Charaka somewhere between 100 BCE and 150 to 200 CE. But then I read other historical analyses that confidently associate him with the 4th century BCE.
Right.
And still others place him even further back, suggesting he was a prominent professor at the legendary University of Taxila around 700 BCE.
Which is a massive spread.
It is. So I have to ask the obvious question here. If the dates for his lifespan anywhere from 400 to 800 years, how is this a biography of a single man?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Are we sure Charaka wasn't just a title for a whole group of wandering doctors? It sounds almost like a ghost story or a collective myth.
That is a very valid skepticism. And to answer it, we really have to look at the etymology of his name, because it provides the absolute biggest clue to his identity and really his methodology.
Okay, break that down for us.
In Sanskrit, the word charaka literally translates to wanderer or ascetic.
Wanderer.
Yes, it refers to a very specific ancient tradition of traveling scholars and physicians. These individuals did not set up a permanent clinic in a city center.
They didn't have like a waiting room.
Exactly. They moved continuously from village to village, crossing through entirely different regional ecosystems, mountains, plains, you name it. And as they traveled, they weren't just treating patients, they were essentially acting as an ancient, decentralized network of data collectors.
So they were basically doing field research.
Precisely. A wanderer would enter a new village and just observe. They'd look at the local diet. They would talk to the indigenous tribal healers who lived in the forests.
The ones who knew the obscure stuff.
Right, the people who knew the properties of incredibly obscure local roots and leaves. They would document how certain diseases spiked during the monsoon season versus the dry season.
Wow.
They gathered empirical data, synthesized local remedies, and even recorded the remnants of those older magico-religious rites.
Just to see if there was any practical medical utility hidden inside the rituals.
Exactly. So it is entirely possible that Charaka began as an individual whose work was so profoundly influential that his name became synonymous with the tradition itself.
Kind of like how Caesar began as a man and evolved into a title for all Roman emperors.
That's a perfect comparison.
So Acharaka might have just meant a wandering physician. But despite that title theory, the historical consensus does point to a specific singular redactor who crystallized all this wandering knowledge into a concrete system.
Yes. While the spirit of the wanderer informs the entire system, the actual compilation of the text we know today points to a specific intellectual genius. Many historical texts link this specific Charaka as the court physician to King Kanishka of the Kushan Empire.
Okay, let's unpack that, because the Kushan Empire is fascinating. If he is tied to King Kanishka, that places him firmly in the 1st to 2nd century CE.
Exactly. And the Kushan Empire was this massive, culturally diverse superpower. It stretched from modern-day Uzbekistan and Afghanistan all the way down into northern India.
That's huge.
Massive. It was a melting pot of Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese influences sitting right astride the Silk Road.
So if Charaka was the court physician to the Kushan king, he would have had access to this just unprecedented flow of international medical knowledge.
Trade goods, exotic botanicals, intense intellectual debate. He had it all.
Which perfectly aligns with this idea of him being the ultimate synthesizer of information. I mean, the French scholar, Professor Sylvain Lévy, actually discovered Buddhist manuscripts in Central Asia and China that strongly suggest this famous Charaka hailed from the Kashmir region.
Which geographically makes total sense.
Right. Kashmir is in the northwestern part of the subcontinent, right in the heart of Kushan territory, and very close to the University of Taxila, which was basically the Oxford or MIT of the ancient world.
Taxila was a massive intellectual hub. Scholars from across Asia came there to study surgery, anatomy, and medicine. So whether Charaka was a professor there centuries earlier or a court physician in the 2nd century CE, that geographic origin in the Northwest places him at the exact crossroads of ancient global knowledge.
But here is where the biography takes a really wild turn, because when you look at the primary text itself, the Charak Samhita, it doesn't open with Charaka saying, hello, I am a doctor from Kashmir and here is my research.
No, it goes much bigger than that.
Yeah, the text gives the origin of this medical knowledge, this grand, sweeping, mythic lineage. And I found this fascinating because it seems to contradict the whole idea of empirical science. The sources say the knowledge originated with the creator deity, Brahma.
Right.
Brahma then passed it to Indra, the king of the gods. Then, the story goes, humanity started getting sick. Diseases were interfering with their lifespans and their spiritual practices. So a massive symposium of mortal sages gathered in the Himalayas to solve the problem of human suffering.
Yes, the text described this legendary gathering of just the greatest minds of antiquity. Sages like Angira, Jamadagni, Vasista, dozens of
And
others.
they realized they needed divine intervention.
Exactly. So they sent a representative, the sage Parwaja, up to the heavens to learn Ayurveda, which means the science of life, directly from Indra. Parwaja brings this knowledge back to earth and teaches it to another great sage, Atreya.
And Atreya then teaches it to his 6
Yeah.
disciples. And one of those disciples is a man named Agnivesha. Now, according to the timeline, Agnivesha actually sat down and wrote the very first comprehensive medical manual called the Agnivesha Tantra way back in the 8th century BCE.
Correct. Agnivesha was considered the most brilliant of the disciples, and his text was the true foundation.
But then, according to the history, Agnivesha's text kind of fades into obscurity. It didn't catch on. It wasn't widely adopted. And this is the crucial moment where Charaka enters the narrative.
Right.
Charaka didn't invent Ayurveda from thin air. He wasn't struck by lightning with medical knowledge. The sources describe him as discovering this ancient and neglected text and completely revitalizing it.
He was acting as an ancient redactor.
Mhm.
And we really need to understand what redaction meant in the classical Indian tradition. It wasn't just proofreading.
Not just fixing spelling errors.
No, it was a complete structural, philosophical, and practical overhaul. Charaka took the Agnivesha Tantra, which was likely brilliant but perhaps disorganized or highly theoretical or just difficult to apply in a real clinical setting.
Sure.
He took that raw material, combined it with the massive mountain of empirical data he and his fellow wanderers had collected from the villages, and he forged it into a scientifically rigorous, usable system.
I love that. Charaka was basically an ancient open source researcher, or like the ultimate editor-in-chief.
Yes.
He crowdsourced medical data from his wanderings, took the foundational manuscript of a predecessor, and built a master framework. And he didn't let ego get in the way. He didn't erase Agnivesha's name.
No, he credited him and Atreya extensively.
But Charaka was the one who made the knowledge actionable.
And making it actionable is exactly what ensured its survival, because ancient texts that were purely theoretical often just disappeared. But having gathered this immense wandering knowledge, Charaka faced a monumental task.
How do you organize a literal encyclopedia?
Right. How do you organize a text covering the human body, botany, pharmacology, and philosophy in a way that other doctors can actually use? The result of his redaction is the Charak Samhita.
The master.
And this text is so robust, so comprehensive, that it remained the absolute gold standard for medical education in India for 2 millennia.
And its influence wasn't just local, right? The Charak Samhita was so highly regarded that centuries later, in the 8th century CE, it was translated into Arabic under the name Saraka.
Yes, and from there, it went even further.
It was eventually translated into Latin, meaning Charaka's medical philosophies were influencing medical thought in the Middle East and Europe far beyond the borders of ancient India.
The scale of the work is staggering. It is a massive intellectual undertaking.
Yeah, let's talk about the sheer size of this book. We are talking about 120 chapters. It contains 12,000 shlokas, or verses. It details over 2,000 different pharmacological medicines.
It's a library disguised as a book.
Really. Now, the outline of the text says he organized it into 8 distinct sthanas, or sections. But I want to avoid just reading a table of contents here because that gets exhausting for everyone. The sections cover everything from basic philosophy to pathology, anatomy, pharmacy. But I was looking at the structure, and I got entirely stuck on one specific section called the Indriya Sthana.
Ah, yes, the Indriya Sthana. That is arguably one of the most fascinating and misunderstood sections of the entire work.
It really is. It's a 12-chapter section dedicated entirely to prognosis, specifically determining whether a patient is going to survive or succumb to their illness. And he does this by looking at the senses and these incredibly subtle signs.
Right.
When I first read about it, I thought, okay, this sounds like fortune telling. How is looking at subtle sensory cues a medical science?
It sounds esoteric, sure, until you realize what he is actually doing. Charaka was training physicians to be hyper-observant detectives.
Detectives.
Yes. In the Indriya Sthana, he isn't using magic. He is using acute clinical observation of the autonomic nervous system and metabolic breakdown. He instructs the physician to observe the patient's shadow, the reflection, the specific smell emanating from their body. Oh, yes. Sudden loss of sensory perception, or even subtle twitches in their musculature.
Give me an example of how that works in practice. How does smelling a patient tell you they are going to die?
Well, let's look at modern medicine for a second. We know today that certain severe metabolic crises produce specific odors.
Like what?
For instance, diabetic ketoacidosis produces a fruity acetone smell on the breath. Severe liver failure, known as hepatic encephalopathy, produces this musty, sweet, slightly fecal odor known as Fitter hepaticus.
Oh, wow.
Charak didn't know about ketones or liver enzymes, obviously, but through decades of wandering and intense observation, he correlated these specific olfactory cues with impending death.
That is incredible.
He noted that if a patient suddenly loses their ability to perceive taste or smell, or if their skin loses its natural luster and becomes cold, the internal systems are actively shutting down. He was tracking the cascade of multi-organ failure using only his 5 senses.
That completely changes the context. He was essentially mapping the terminal phases of disease through sensory biometrics. And what's truly wild about all of this, I mean, the 120 chapters, the detailed tracking of organ failure, the 2,000 medicines, the format he chose to write it in is just, it's unbelievable. The entire Charak Samhita was written in a poetic, metered format.
Yes, the 12,000 shlokas are rhythmic poetry.
When I first realized that, I was baffled. I mean, why would you write a dense medical textbook as poetry? But then you have to put yourself in the context of the era, you know?
They didn't have printing presses.
Exactly. They didn't have cloud storage. Knowledge was passed down orally from a guru to a disciple. If you write out a textbook in standard prose and ask someone to memorize it, human error pretty much guarantees that within 3 generations, the text will be completely corrupted.
Sentences get dropped, words get swapped, the meaning changes.
But if you encode complex medical data into rhythm, meter, and rhyme, it acts as an uncrackable mnemonic device. It's like a 12,000-verse song lyric. If a student forgets a word, the rhythm breaks, and they immediately know they made a mistake.
It is a brilliant technological solution to the problem of oral data degradation.
It really is.
And Charak was hyper-aware of how a text needed to function to be useful. He actually outlines, within the text itself, the criteria for a good medical treatise.
He lays down rules for writing.
Yes. He lists 36 specific devices, or tantra yukti, that a text must employ. He insists that a medical book must be entirely free of repetition. It must use traditional ideas but present them in a way that is easily comprehensible. And crucially, it must be intelligible to all 3 levels of disciples.
Which are?
The dull, the mediocre, and the highly intelligent.
That's hilarious, but also very practical. He also explicitly states that the text must be capable of defeating opponents in debates. And this paints such a vivid picture of the intellectual culture of ancient India. This wasn't a society where a doctor just handed down a decree and everyone accepted it without question. Medicine was a contact sport.
It really was.
The text was a tool for active, public intellectual combat. Charaka lists 8 specific topics and methods for debating other physicians. If another doctor challenged your diagnosis in front of a patient or a king, you had to be able to intellectually dismantle their argument using logic, pathology, and textual evidence.
The debate culture was foundational. It fostered immense rigor. You couldn't just rely on faith, You had to prove your clinical reasoning.
Right.
And that rigor is captured perfectly in the opening philosophical statement of the Samhita, which I think is one of the most powerful sentences in medical history.
What is it?
Charak states, "Entire misery of mind and body depends on ignorance, while entire happiness resides in pure knowledge."
Man, that is a heavy statement. He is saying that ignorance isn't just a lack of schooling. Ignorance is the literal root cause of physical disease.
Yes.
If you don't know how your body works, if you don't know how you relate to your environment, you will inevitably make choices that destroy your health.
Exactly. Which transitions us perfectly from the structure of his book to the actual core philosophy of his medical universe. What was the pure knowledge he was trying to impart?
Let's get into it.
When you dive into Ayurvedic principles, you encounter terms that initially sound very esoteric. But if we slow down and translate the concepts, they reveal an incredibly systematic view of biology.
Okay, let's get into those concepts, because this is where my modern skepticism really flared up initially. Everything in Charaka's system begins with the Panchamahabhuta Siddhanta, the theory of the 5 great elements.
Right.
Charaka posits that absolutely everything in the universe, including the human body, is composed of 5 elements. You have Prithvi, which is earth or solidity, Ape, water or cohesion, Tes, a fire or energy, Vayu, air or mobility. And akasha, space or spatial organization. Now
Yes.
I'm looking at this list. Earth, water, fire, wind, space. And honestly, it sounds a lot like astrology. It sounds like ancient mysticism. How do we leap from space and wind to actual treatable medical science?
It's a very common hurdle for modern readers. And the mistake we make is taking the translation too literally. Charaka isn't saying you have literal dirt and campfire flames inside your bounds.
Okay, good.
He is using the physical elements of the natural world as metaphors for fundamental states of matter and biophysical principles.
Break that down.
Prithvi, earth, represents solid mass and structure. Your bones, your tissue. Ape, water, represents all fluid dynamics and cohesion. So your plasma, your cellular fluid.
Got it.
Tejas, fire, represents transformation and metabolism, your digestive enzymes, your cellular energy production. Vayu, air, represents movement and propulsion, your nerve impulses, the peristalsis in your gut. And akasha, space, represents the physical cavities where these interactions take place, your lungs, your digestive tract, the spaces between cells.
Okay, viewing them as states of matter and biophysical processes makes a lot more sense. It's almost like an ancient periodic table.
Precisely.
But a pile of elements isn't a living human being. How do these elemental forces actually function together to create life?
Well, this brings us to the most famous concept in Ayurveda, and really the cornerstone of Charaka's clinical practice, the Tridosha.
The doshas.
Right. Charaka taught that these 5 foundational elements combine to form 3 primary biological energies, or doshas, that govern all physiological and psychological processes in the body.
And the 3 doshas are vata, pitta, and kapha. And again, the direct translations are often wind, bile, and phlegm, which just sound super archaic. Let's break down what these actually mean clinically.
Sure. Think of the human body not as a machine with isolated parts, but as a complex living ecosystem, like a rainforest.
Okay, rainforest.
In this rainforest, kapha is the soil and the water. It provides the heavy, stable structure, the lubrication, and the baseline immunity. It is what physically holds the ecosystem together.
Right.
Pitta is the sunlight and the ambient heat. It is the energy of transformation. It governs metabolism, digestion, hormonal balance, and body temperature. It breaks things down and processes them.
And vata.
Vata is the wind. It is the energy of movement and transport. It moves the nutrients through the rivers. It rustles the leaves. In the body, vata governs the nervous system, breathing, cellular transport, and the movement of muscles.
I really love that ecosystem metaphor because if you think about it that way, the core definition of health in Charaka's system, which is equilibrium, makes perfect sense.
Exactly.
If the soil, the heat, and the wind are balanced, the rainforest thrives. But if they deviate, the ecosystem gets sick. If there is a massive storm, a vata imbalance, too much wind, the trees get uprooted, the soil dries out, and things become brittle.
Yes, and in a human, that might manifest as extreme anxiety, neurological tremors, or brittle joints like arthritis.
And if there's drought and intense heat, a pitta imbalance, the forest burns. In a human, that manifests as acute inflammation, fevers, ulcers, and acid reflux.
And if there is too much water in soil, a kapha imbalance, the forest floods. It becomes a swamp and it stagnates. In the body, this looks like lethargy, fluid retention, severe congestion, and metabolic sluggishness.
It's so logical.
What Charaka introduced here was a profound paradigm shift in how we view disease. He didn't see the body as static. He saw it as a dynamic, continuous interaction with the environment. If you have an ulcer, he doesn't just treat the stomach lining. He identifies that your ambient heat, your pitta, is raging out of control. So he treats the systemic root cause to cool the entire ecosystem back to equilibrium.
This is where I have to pause and ask about the scientific validity, because if we strip away the rainforest metaphor and we map these ancient terms onto modern endocrinology and molecular biology, does this actually hold up? Is there empirical overlap?
The overlap is honestly staggering. While Charaka did not have a microscope to see cells or biochemical receptors, his macroscopic clinical observations were incredibly astute.
How so?
Modern integrative and systems biology recognizes that human health relies on 3 major regulatory networks. First, the nervous system, which controls movement, signaling, and rapid response. This correlates flawlessly with the functions of vata. Second, the endocrine and metabolic systems, which control digestion, energy transformation, and hormonal regulation. This correlates directly with pitta.
Oh, wow.
And third, the immune and structural systems, which provide defense, tissue integrity, and fluid balance. This correlates perfectly with kapha. Charaka's Tridosha framework was an early, brilliant heuristic for mapping these exact physiological realities without needing to know the molecular mechanics.
That is incredible. He deduced the macro systems just by observing the downstream effects.
Yes.
And what's even more fascinating is that this balance isn't a one-size-fits-all metric. This is where we get into the absolute bedrock of personalized healthcare, which is the concept of prakriti.
Right, the Constitution.
According to Charaka, there is no generic normal human. Every single person is born with a unique individual constitution, a specific innate ratio of vata, pitta, and kapha.
Yes, your prakriti is your baseline operating system. It is who you fundamentally are. The Charak Samhita states that this baseline is set at the very moment of conception by the union of Shukra, the male seed, and Shonita, the female egg.
But it doesn't stop at conception. What is truly remarkable for a text over 2,000 years old is that Charaka explicitly noted that this constitution is heavily influenced by the mother's diet, her lifestyle, and the environmental conditions during her pregnancy.
Which is, it's wild.
Hang on, that is exactly what we call modern epigenetics. The idea that environmental factors and maternal stress can turn certain genetic expressions on or off in the fetus. Are you saying Charaka was charting epigenetics?
Functionally, yes. He recognized that the maternal environment dictates the developmental trajectory of the child's constitution.
Yeah.
And understanding a patient's prakriti changes the entire nature of medical treatment.
Right, because if my prakriti is naturally dominant in pitta, meaning I run hot, I have a fast metabolism, I have intense focus, what is a balanced, healthy state for me would actually be considered a diseased, imbalanced state for someone whose prakriti is naturally dominant in kapha. Someone who might naturally be slower, cooler, and more structurally dense. This is why standardizing treatments doesn't always work. You cannot treat a patient effectively without first understanding their unique baseline ecosystem.
And maintaining that specific ecosystem relies heavily on two other crucial concepts in Charaka's physiology, Agni and Ogas.
Agni means fire, right?
It literally translates to fire, yes. But in a medical context, it refers to your digestive and metabolic fire. Charaka theorized that almost all systemic disease originates in the gut. If your Agni is weak or irregular, you cannot properly process the food you eat.
Let's walk through the mechanism of that. If I eat a really heavy meal and my metabolic fire, my Agni, is low, what happens?
According to Charaka, the food remains undigested or partially digested. It ferments and turns into a toxic, sticky substance called ama. Yes. This ama then circulates through the body, clogging the physical channels and blocking the flow of cellular nutrition. Modern functional medicine describes a very similar pathway. We're discussing gut dysbiosis, leaky gut syndrome, and how circulating endotoxins trigger systemic inflammation.
Wow.
Charaka viewed the strengthening of Agni as the absolute primary defense against disease.
And if your digestion is strong and your doshas are in equilibrium, your body produces the ultimate positive byproduct, which is oshas.
Oshas, yes.
Oshas is described as the essence of vitality and immunity. It's what gives you resistance to disease, deep physical strength, mental clarity, and even a glowing physical complexion. It is the ultimate marker of holistic health.
But we have to remember, Charaka's philosophy wasn't just abstract theory floating in the clouds. He wasn't a philosopher disconnected from the physical reality of blood and bone. He was, fundamentally, a rigorous empirical anatomist and diagnostician.
Let's get into the anatomy, because I want to challenge the idea of how he actually knew what was inside the body. Remember the timeline here. We are talking about antiquity. Dissection of human corpses was culturally and religiously taboo in many parts of the ancient world. You couldn't just open people up.
No, you could.
Yet, the Charaka Samhita explicitly enumerates 360 bones in the human body. How did he know that?
Well, it's important to clarify his count first. Modern anatomy dictates we have 206 distinct bones. Charaka's count of 360 includes teeth, tooth sockets, various cartilages, and prominent bony processes as individual units.
Oh, okay.
But the sheer meticulous nature of categorizing the skeletal structure demonstrates a fierce commitment to direct observation. Ancient physicians often studied anatomy by placing a deceased body in a river, allowing the soft tissue to slowly decompose over days, and then gently brushing away the layers with soft reeds.
Oh, wow.
Yes, they did this to study the skeletal and vascular structures without technically violating the religious taboos against cutting the flesh.
That is both incredibly macabre and incredibly ingenious. And through these observations, he mapped the cardiovascular system. He recognized the heart as the central controlling organ of the body.
Right.
He described the heart as being connected to the entire system via 13 main channels, or srotas. These channels carried nutrients in and waste out. And he explicitly stated that the obstruction of these channels is the primary mechanical cause of disease and physical deformity.
This is a monumental medical insight.
Yeah.
Understanding that vascular or channel obstruction leads to pathology is the ancient conceptual precursor to our modern understanding of hemodynamics.
Yeah.
He didn't have the vocabulary for cholesterol or plaque, but he perfectly described the mechanics of atherosclerosis, where blocked arteries lead to heart disease and how lymphatic blockages cause swelling and illness. He recognized the human body as an integrated network of transport systems.
But he didn't just look at the macro level of bones and blood vessels. He looked at the micro level. And this is where my mind was legitimately blown. Charaka describes something called krimi.
Yes, creamy.
He categorized these generally as parasitic worms, which you can see with the naked eye. But then he made a clear, definitive distinction between visible krimi and invisible krimi that act as hidden agents of disease.
Which is an incredibly early conceptualization of germ theory.
But how? Let's do a thought experiment here. How do you deduce that a microorganism exists if you can't see it? It's like a physicist guessing the existence of dark matter just by observing gravity. How did Charaka deduce invisible germs?
It comes down to tracking cause and effect over long periods of observation. A wandering physician watches a skin infection spread from one family member to another without any physical exchange of fluids. They observe how milk spoils or how wounds putrefy if not cleaned.
Right.
Charaka deduced that there must be microscopic, invisible entities inhabiting the blood, the mucus, and the environment that invade the host and cause pathology. He even classified them based on where they lived, blood-borne, mucus-borne, or feces-borne. He couldn't see the bacteria, but he mapped their exact behavioral footprint.
That is the definition of empirical reasoning. So, armed with this knowledge of energies, organs, and invisible pathogens, if you were a patient in ancient India and you went to see an Ayurvedic physician trained in Charaka's methods, how would they actually figure out what was wrong with you?
They had a system for it.
Right, a profoundly structured diagnostic toolkit. They use something called the Nidana Panchak, which is a five-fold approach to understanding a disease.
The Nidana Panchak is essentially the ancient version of a comprehensive clinical workup. It is a highly logical sequence.
Walk us through it.
It starts with Hetu, which is identifying the causative factors or etiology. What did you eat? What is your stress level?
Okay.
Then comes Purvarupa, noting the prodromal or premonitory early signs. What were you feeling right before the fever hit? Third is Rupa, observing the actual present clinical features and symptoms.
Makes sense.
Fourth is Upashaya, which is fascinating. It's therapeutic testing. The doctor might apply a hot compress. If it makes the pain better, they confirm a vata, or cold wind, imbalance. If it makes it worse, they confirm a pitta hot fire imbalance.
Like trial and error, but structured.
Exactly. And finally, Samprapti, which is mapping the pathogenesis, the exact biochemical pathway the disease took from the gut to the affected organ.
And they paired that logical framework with the physical Dashavida Pariksha, the tenfold examination. Again, I want you to picture this. You sit down with this ancient physician. They aren't just looking at a chart and asking where it hurts. They are taking your pulse. Nadi Pariksha.
Pulse diagnosis.
Now, I've always been slightly skeptical of pulse diagnosis. How can feeling my wrist tell you I have a stomach issue? Let's explain the actual mechanism behind this.
Pulse diagnosis in Ayurveda is highly complex. The physician places 3 fingers on the radial artery. Each finger is feeling for the specific qualities of the 3 doshas. They are assessing the rate, rhythm, volume, and tension of the blood flow. Modern hemodynamics tells us that arterial stiffness, heart rate variability, and blood viscosity change dynamically based on our neurological and metabolic states.
So it's real data.
Very real data. When a physician feels a rapid, erratic pulse, which they might metaphorically describe as moving like a frog, they are feeling sympathetic nervous system overdrive or a pitta imbalance. A slow, heavy pulse, moving like a swan, indicates parasympathetic dominance or vascular resistance, a kapha imbalance. They were reading the microscopic changes in vascular pressure as a readout of the entire autonomic nervous system.
So they are reading your pulse, they are examining your urine, they're looking at the texture of your stool, checking the coating on your tongue to assess your digestive fire.
Yes.
They are listening to the resonance of your voice, feeling your skin temperature, observing the whites of your eyes, and assessing your overall physical build and mental stamina. They are building a highly individualized, holistic biological profile of you before they ever prescribe a single leaf or pill.
And speaking of prescriptions, this is an area where Charaka's text heavily disrupts modern assumptions.
Oh, for sure.
There is a very common contemporary stereotype. that ancient Indian traditions, and Ayurveda in particular, were and are exclusively vegetarian, rooted in total nonviolence.
Ah, yes.
But the Charaka Samhita reveals a highly pragmatic, relentlessly empirical approach to medicine that utilized whatever worked in nature to save a human life.
This was the snakebite example from the intro. The text documents over 150 medicinal substances of animal origin. And we aren't just talking about passive products like cow's milk or honey.
No, it goes much further.
Charaka prescribes the meat of wild animals like fox, iguana, and crocodile for specific severe wasting diseases. He uses fish oil, bird eggs, and beeswax. He specifically recommends mamsa rasa, which translates to meat soup or bone broth, for pregnant women starting from their 6th month to ensure the structural strength of the developing fetus.
He was a scientist first. If an animal product had a specific pharmacological property, a certain heat or oiliness or dense nutritional strength that could reverse a severe life-threatening vata deficit, he used it. He was not bound by strict religious dogma when the patient's survival was on the line.
Okay, so once this incredibly thorough personalized diagnosis is made and the appropriate herbal, mineral, or animal-based medicine is selected, how does the actual healing happen? Charaka didn't just hand you a prescription and push you out the door.
Never.
He laid out strict rules for the entire ecosystem of the clinical environment, which he called the Sakitsa Chatishpada, or the 4 pillars of therapy.
This concept is fundamental to his approach, and frankly, modern medicine could learn a lot from it. Charaka stated that successful treatment requires 4 equal interdependent pillars: the physician, the medicine, the attendant or nurse, and the patient.
Okay.
If any one of these pillars is weak, ignorant, or uncooperative, the entire structure of healing collapses.
It's amazing how much weight he places on the attendant and the patient. Today, modern healthcare puts almost the entirety of the weight on the doctor and the pharmaceutical drug.
Absolutely.
But Charaka elevated the role of the nurse. He demanded they be skilled, affectionate, and clean. And he recognized that the patient's own mindset, compliance, and social circle are critical variables in whether they survive. This proves he deeply understood the psychosomatic nature of healing.
And to ensure that the first pillar, the physician, was absolute in their integrity, Charaka instituted a strict ethical code. Students entering medical training had to take Charaka's oath. And it's worth noting that this oath predates the Greek Hippocratic Oath by centuries.
The oath is intense. It dictates that doctors must be compassionate, pure, truthful, and dedicated to lifelong learning. It explicitly states that taking on the mantle of a physician is a symbol of immense responsibility to society, not a path to quick wealth.
It wasn't about getting rich.
Not at all. The text even mentioned that doctors face severe punishments from the state, up to and including the death penalty, for severe medical misconduct, malpractice, or ethical violations. You didn't just lose your license, you lost your life.
But perhaps the most fiercely debated aspect of his ethical code, both then and now, is his specific instruction regarding terminal incurable diseases. Charaka explicitly instructed physicians not to take on or treat patients whose conditions were truly incurable.
This really made me pause, and I want to push on this. In today's world, our medical default, our ethical baseline, is to try to keep people alive at all costs. We use ventilators, extreme surgeries, and aggressive chemotherapies, even when the prognosis is essentially zero.
Right.
We view stopping treatment as a failure or even abandonment. Why would the revered father of medicine explicitly tell his doctors to walk away from a dying patient? Isn't that a violation of compassion?
It forces us to confront our own philosophical view of suffering. Charaka wasn't advocating for cruelty. He was making a deeply pragmatic and ethical argument about the limits of human intervention.
No.
Charaka argued that actively treating an unequivocally incurable patient inevitably does 3 things. First, it provides false hope to the patient and their family. Second, it drains the family's wealth on futile remedies. And third, and most importantly, it artificially prolongs the agony of the dying process.
Oh, wow.
Furthermore, he argued it damages the reputation of the physician and the science of Ayurveda itself because the public will see the medicine failing.
It really reframes the conversation around end-of-life care. Is preventing false hope, protecting a family from medical bankruptcy, and allowing nature to take its course without inflicting the burden of futile, painful treatments actually the more compassionate choice?
It's an incredibly heavy question that modern palliative care doctors grapple with every single day.
It is. Charaka believed the physician's job was to cure the curable, palliate the manageable, and respectfully step back when the natural lifespan had reached its absolute end. But his ethics went far beyond just life or death clinical decisions.
They extended into everyday life.
Yeah, through the concept of sadvruta, which is the code of right conduct.
Sadhvrutta is essentially ancient behavioral therapy. It highlights the inseparable mind-body connection in Chartaka's system. He explicitly noted that negative psychological states, specifically lust, anger, greed, jealousy, and excessive ego, directly cause mental illness, which will inevitably cascade and manifest as physical disease.
You cannot be physically healthy if your mind is poisoned by chronic rage or stress. Your cortisol levels spike, your pitta ignites, your digestion fails, and you get sick.
This ties right into the immense importance he placed on social support and human connection in the healing process. The sources mention specific clinical procedures that require the presence of the patient's community.
Like what?
For example, Vamana karma, which is a very intense therapeutic vomiting procedure used for profound detoxification. Chartaka stated that having supportive, affectionate friends physically present during the procedure was practically a medical requirement to keep the patient calm and grounded.
Or the Sutakagra, the specialized childbirth rituals. They carefully curated an environment for the laboring mother that was filled with experienced, supportive women, soothing sounds, and specific social rituals designed to lower her anxiety and prevent postpartum complications. Healing was a community event.
If we take a step back and look at this entire holistic framework, the focus on ethics, daily behavior, diet, and stress management, it scales up to what is arguably Charaka's greatest relevance to us in the 21st century.
Which is?
His approach to the prevention of non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
This is exactly where ancient history violently collides with the modern global health crisis. Non-communicable diseases are things like type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and certain chronic respiratory diseases and cancers.
Right.
These aren't viruses you catch from a cough on an airplane. They are lifestyle diseases, and they are the leading causes of death in the world today. Thousands of years ago, Charaka famously stated, "It is more important to prevent the occurrence of disease than to seek a cure."
While Charaka obviously didn't use the modern epidemiological term NCD, his entire medical system was built around the exact same causality. He recognized clearly that these chronic systemic conditions are almost entirely the result of human behavior.
Behavior like what?
Ignoring the rules of diet, engaging in a chronic lack of physical activity, and suffering from poor mental health and unmanaged stress. He saw that if you live out of alignment with your environment, your systems slowly degrade.
To combat this, he didn't just prescribe pills. He prescribed incredibly detailed preventative lifestyle strategies. First is dinacharya, which are daily health regimens. He outlined exactly when you should wake up, ideally before sunrise, how you should clean your senses, like scraping the tongue, washing the eyes, when to exercise, and when to meditate.
Very regimented.
Then there is ritucharya, which are seasonal regimens. This makes so much sense. You shouldn't eat or behave the exact same way in the hot, dry peak of summer as you do in the cold, damp depths of winter, because the external environment drastically alters your internal doshas.
But the absolute foundation of his preventative medicine is ahara vidi vijeshayatan, the specific rules of dietetics. Charaka viewed food as the ultimate foundational medicine. If your diet is correct, medicine is of no need. If your diet is wrong, medicine is of no use.
That's a great quote.
He advocated for moderation, avoiding foods with opposing qualities, like eating hot fish with cold milk, which he believed confused the digestive fire, and crucially, tailoring every single meal to your specific prakriti.
If we think about the body as an ecosystem, as you mentioned earlier, Charaka is essentially giving you the ultimate land management manual.
Yes, exactly.
If modern medicine is the emergency crew that shows up with chainsaws and helicopters when the forest is already on fire, Charaka is the park ranger telling you how to manage the underbrush, monitor the soil moisture, and prevent the spark from ever igniting in the first place. Why wait for the catastrophic heart attack when you can maintain the vascular system daily?
And if the ecosystem does start to accumulate debris and toxins, Charaka formalized a radical intervention called panchakarma.
I've heard of that.
It's a profound 5-step detoxification and clinical purification therapy. It involves oil massages, heat therapies, purgation, and enemas, all designed to literally unstick the accumulated metabolic toxins, the ama, from the deep tissues and flush them out of the body's channels.
He paired this detoxification with Raziana, which is rejuvenation therapy aimed at increasing cellular longevity, intellect, and immunity. And this is where his meticulous centuries-old documentation of herbs becomes incredibly relevant today. He utilized plants like turmeric and ashwagandha extensively in these rejuvenation protocols.
And modern botanical pharmacology has completely vindicated his empirical observations on this front. We now know, through thousands of rigorous double-blind clinical trials, that turmeric contains a compound called curcumin, which is a potent systemic anti-inflammatory agent.
Right.
It operates on molecular pathways to reduce joint pain and systemic swelling.
And ashwagandha. It is recognized globally now as a powerful adaptogen. It actively modulates the endocrine system, lowers circulating cortisol levels, and effectively reduces physiological stress, which, as Charaka correctly noted thousands of years ago, is a primary driver of those deadly lifestyle diseases.
Absolutely.
His holistic approach to balancing bodily systems through these specific botanicals is exactly what top-tier integrative medicine clinics are now prescribing to executives and athletes.
We have this towering genius of a man compiling this impossibly massive 12,000-verse text full of advanced vascular anatomy, early germ theory, highly personalized epigenetic medicine, and preventive lifestyle care.
But that brings me to a massive historical mystery. Charaka writes this text around 2,000 years ago. In the intervening millennia, empires rise and fall. India faces centuries of devastating foreign occupations. Massive ancient universities and their libraries were literally burned to the ground.
Yeah, a lot of destruction.
How on earth did this specific fragile knowledge written on palm leaves survive the brutal meat grinder of history to reach you, the listener, today?
It is a miracle of intellectual preservation. It survived because of a cultural mechanism we can call the chain of custody.
Chain of custody?
Yes, the Charak Samhita was never treated as a static, sacred relic meant to be locked in a box and left to gather dust. It was kept alive by a continuous, unbroken chain of brilliant scholars and commentators over 1,500 years.
They didn't just copy it, right?
No, these commentators didn't just passively copy the text. They aggressively debated it, explained it, and translated its deep poetic Sanskrit into practical, actionable applications for their own specific eras.
Reading the history of these commentators is like reading a timeline of unsung heroes. In the 4th century, you have Patara Harichandra, who wrote a foundational commentary called the Charkakanyasa.
Right.
In the 5th century, Swami Kumara adds his insights. In the 6th century, Jajata, who was a pupil of another legendary Ayurvedic master named Vagbhata, brings his clinical experience to the text.
But the undisputed heavyweight champion of the commentators, the most famous and influential of them all, arrived in the 11th century, Chakrapani Datta. He wrote a magnum opus commentary called Ayurveda Deepika, which beautifully translates to the light of Ayurveda. This commentary became so vital that it is now considered the definitive, inseparable companion to the Charaka Samhita.
What made Chakrapani so special? Why was his commentary the one that stuck?
Chakrapani didn't just summarize Chakra's words. He provided intense grammatical insights to decode the ancient poetry. He explained the underlying logic, linking one chapter to the next, revealing the architectural skeleton of the book.
Oh, wow.
And he clarified the most complex, dense philosophical arguments about the nature of the soul, disease, and matter. His mastery of both the medicine and linguistics was so absolute that his contemporaries gave him the title Charaka Chaturana, which essentially means he was an avatar of Charaka himself.
And the tradition just kept going. You have Shivata Sen in the 15th century adapting the medicine for a new era. You have Gangadhar Roy in the 19th century who lived to be 86 years old and wrote a massive commentary called the Jalpakalpataru.
Yes, incredible scholars.
But I have to push back on this entire process. I understand keeping a book alive, but if Charaka's original text was so perfect, so divinely inspired, and scientifically rigorous, why did it need 45 different major commentaries over 1,500 years?
That's a fair question.
Why couldn't the science just stand on its own? It makes me wonder if we are romanticizing a text that was actually deeply flawed and constantly needed fixing.
That is exactly the kind of critical question the ancient debaters would have welcomed. But the need for commentaries isn't proof of the text flaw. It is proof of the reality of a living science.
How so?
Think about it. Human language evolves dramatically over 1,000 years. A poetic metaphor written in ancient Kashmir in 100 CE might be completely incomprehensible to a doctor working in Bengal in 1,500 CE.
Okay, language drift makes sense.
But beyond language, environments change. New diseases emerge as trade routes expand. The social context of patients shifts dramatically. The commentators weren't fixing errors. They were translating the core principles, the mechanics of the doshas, the importance of Agni, the individualized care, and applying them to modern context.
Adapting it.
Yes. They ensured the ancient science remained clinically actionable rather than becoming a dead, obsolete relic of antiquity. They kept the software continually updated to run on new hardware.
And thank God they did, because Ayurveda faced an existential threat relatively recently. During the British colonial occupation of India, indigenous sciences were actively suppressed in favor of Western allopathic medicine.
It was a very dark period.
The historical sources note that Ayurvedic colleges were forcibly closed down. Ancient libraries and manuscript collections were scattered or destroyed, and the Vaidyas, the accomplished hereditary Ayurvedic masters, were marginalized, stripped of their state patronage, and often persecuted. Ayurveda was forced into a severe state of hibernation, kept alive only in rural villages and underground family lineages.
It was a devastating disruption to a lineage that had survived for millennia. The impact of colonial suppression cannot be overstated. Today, Ayurveda is still in a state of active recovery. It is working to reclaim its full clinical capacity, standardize its education, and integrate its profound ancient wisdom with modern, double-blind scientific validation.
All right, let's bring all of this together. We have journeyed through the life and legacy of a true revolutionary.
Truly.
Maharishi Charaka started as a wandering physician, observing the natural world, talking to villagers, and tracking the subtle signs of disease. He took on the monumental, perhaps unprecedented task of editing a complex, poetic 12,000-verse medical encyclopedia.
A staggering achievement.
He mapped the human bones, identified the flow of the cardiovascular system, deduced the existence of invisible pathogens without a microscope, and he built a comprehensive system of personalized medicine and preventive lifestyle care that is quite literally the blueprint for solving today's modern epidemic of chronic lifestyle diseases.
His life's work proves unequivocally that profound scientific observation and medical genius do not require modern technology. They require a disciplined, observant mind, a deeply holistic perspective, and a fundamental understanding of the human body's inseparable relationship with the natural environment.
Which leaves us with a final, slightly uncomfortable thought to ponder. Today, modern medicine is pushing relentlessly toward the absolute bleeding edge of technology. We are spending billions upon billions of dollars on CRISPR gene editing, microbiome sequencing, and personalized DNA mapping to create what we call personalized medicine.
Yes, billions.
Are we essentially just using billion-dollar Silicon Valley technology to slowly rediscover the exact same biological truths that Maharishi Charaka figured out by simply taking a patient's pulse in a rural Indian village 2,000 years ago? And if that is true, if we are just now catching up to his holistic view of the human ecosystem, what other profound, life-saving ancient insights are currently sitting unread in a dusty manuscript, completely ignored by our modern hospitals?